At 7 a.m. the train crept to a stop deep in the forest of Campiagini. Mist shrouded the trees around the clearing. It was November 8, 1918. World War I was ending and World War II was beginning, though scarcely anyone could imagine it at the time. From the train's rear car, the passengers could see another car on the siding. They did not know where they were, but they knew this was the end of a nightmare journey, a journey they hoped would end the fighting. A French army officer appeared to inform the 6 German passengers that Marshal Ferdinand Foch, supremacy commander of the Allied forces, would receive them at 9 a.m. Matthias Erzberger, the spokesman of the group and a leader in Germany's Catholic Center Party, reflected that seeking an armistice was a strange mission for a civilian, but the new parliamentary government in Berlin did not altogether trust the military, and the high command was only too happy to avoid the onus of bearing the white flag. Erzberger recalled Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg's last words to him: God go with you and try to get the best you can for our country. A few minutes before 9 that morning, the Germans entered Foch's sleeping car headquarters. Then ramrod straight at age 67, Foch appeared. What brings these gentlemen here? He asked. Erzberger said they had come to receive the Allied proposal for an armistice. I have no proposal to make, said Foch. A moment of consternation followed. One of the Germans asked how he wanted them to express themselves. Do you ask for an armistice? Replied Foch, easily formal. If you do, I can acquaint you with the conditions under which it can be obtained. They asked for an armistice. There was complete silence as an aide read out 34 terms. For the first time, the Germans comprehended the magnitude of their defeat. Germany was to evacuate all captured territory. It now held most of Belgium and Luxembourg, and a sixth of France, plus Alsace, the Lorraine, the province it had annexed from France after the War of 1870 to 1871. Allied forces would move into Germany to occupy the Rhine's left bank and 3 bridgeheads on the right. The German fleet was to steam to the British naval base at Scape Flow in Scotland for internment. Germany would turn over 150,000 freight cars, 5,000 locomotives, and 5,000 trucks. War materials to be surrendered, including 1,700 aircraft, 5,000 artillery pieces, and 25,000 machine guns. When the reading ended, Erzberger asked for an immediate ceasefire. Foch refused there would be no ceasefire until the Germans accepted all 34 terms. They had 72 hours in which to decide. 3 days later, in Foch rail car at Kempinge-Isenberg signed the armistice. The ceasefire took effect at 11 a.m. on November 11, 1918, and eerie silence fell along the battle lines. Peace came so suddenly we were stunned, wrote a French officer walking along our trenches some hours after. I was surprised to see all our soldiers at listening posts or in shelters as if the war were still on. In contrast was the scene in the cities. London throbbed with wild celebrations. Total strangers copulated in doorways and on pavements, wrote British historian A.J.P. Taylor. They were asserting the triumph of life over death. Prime Minister David Lloyd George, too exuberant to wait for formalities, came out of his 10 Downing Street residence at 10:55 a.m. and kept shouting to startled onlookers at 11 o'clock this morning, the war will be over. In Paris, 20,000 people massed in front of the brilliantly lit opera and joyously sang the Marseillaise. George Clemenceau, the 77-year-old prime, reported the armistice terms to an assemblage of the Chamber of Deputies and Senate, wiped his eyes and hurried away to spend the afternoon alone walking in his garden. In Milan, the editor of the Daily 2, Popolo Bento Mussolini, veteran of a short and undistinguished tour on the Italian front against the Germans, chief allies, the Australians, held court for some admirers dressed in swaggering black uniforms. In the United States, shrinking factory whistles added to the clamor of jubilant crowds, and in Washington, President Woodrow Wilson wrote out a statement pledging Americans to assist in establishing a just democracy. Throughout the world, but in Russia, the day passed virtually without notice. Having made a separate peace with Germany 8 months earlier, the country was now in the theories of civil war between country revolutionary white forces and red armies committed to the Bolshevik cause of Vladimir Ulyanov, better known as Lenin. Nowhere did word of the armistice prove more shattering than at a military hospital in the small German town of Pacewalk. Among the soldiers who heard the news from a sobbing pastor was an obscure Corporal Adolf Hitler, still half blinded as a result of a British gas attack on the Bergen front. As he later described his reaction, I tottered and groped my way back to the ward, threw myself on my bunk, and dug my burning head into my blanket and pillow. So it had all been in vain all the sacrifices and privations. The armistice, he raged, was the greatest villainy of the century. In the wake of 4 years of unpredicted destruction in Europe, farmers returned to their fields, refugees and soldiers trudged home. By Armistice Day, the treasures of the combatants were depleted. Although hostilities were over, the Allies continued their wartime blockade of food shipments bound for German ports. Malnutrition was now widespread in Germany. Population in lands farther east faced more acute famine. Yet, despite the carnage and grief, there was on November 11th a hope that another such Holocaust would be made impossible. This hope fed two Masonic visions. One came out of Russia, where Lenin was calling for a world revolution that under communism would sweep away old notions of private property and class distinctions and unite the human race. The other came from the U.S., where President Woodrow Wilson had captured the imagination of people everywhere by proclaiming the principles he believed essential for establishing a just and lasting peace. Wilson had first enumerated his aims in 14 points to Congress in January 1918. In place of secret agreements, he said there would be open covenants of peace, openly arrived at armaments would be reduced to the lowest points consistent with domestic safety. All barriers to trade would be removed. There would be no annexations and no punitive damages. One proposal above all engrossed Wilson. A League of Nations was to be formed, charged with keeping the peace and guaranteeing the independence and security of great and small states alike. It was on the basis of these declarations that the Germans had turned to Wilson, not to the leaders of Britain or France, when they decided to seek an armistice. It was from Wilson, after a series of rigidly polite exchanges by transatlantic wireless, that they had learned that Marshal Foch would receive them. Of all the world leaders, none seemed to hold a strong hand than the American president. The United States, which had not entered the war until April 1917, almost 3 years after it began, was now the most powerful nation on earth. The arrival in France of 1.7 million fresh U.S. troops had turned the tide against Germany in the summer of 1918. Shielded by the broad Atlantic, the U.S. itself had been spared physically destruction of any sort. Its great economic strength was Wilson's to command for post-war healing. The president, a man of vision, and high ideals, was also an extraordinarily complicated personality, a scholar turned politicians. He intimidated many by the force of his intellect, and his glacial formalities kept associates at a distance. Although no previous president had ever left the country while in office, Wilson was determined to head the American delegations to the peace conference in Paris in January 1919. He rejected all agreements. He had sent young men overseas to die, and he must see that others shall not be called upon to make that sacrifice again. Arriving at the French harbor of Brest, Wilson was given a reception never before or since accorded a visiting statesman, and almost religious favor greeted him on his visits to England and Italy before the conference opened. Children strewed flowers in his path. Immense crowds cheered themselves hoarse, watching them. Herbert Hoover, chosen by Wilson to set up the machinery for post-war relief and reconstruction, later observed that to these people no such evangel of peace had appeared since Christ preached the Sermon on the Mount. The Paris Peace Conference opened on January 18, 1919, in the massive stone pile of the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs on the Quai d'Orsay on the left bank of the Seine. The sheer immensity of the task was appalling. The conference was charged with settling the future of 400 million Europeans, 10 million former subjects of the Ottoman Turk in the Middle East, and some 12 million people in the colonies Germany had held in Africa and the Pacific. Russia was not represented at the peace conference. The outcome of its Civil War was still in doubt, and the Western powers refused to recognize the Bolshevik government as long as a final white victory appeared possible. Germany and its wartime allies, now the states of Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Turkey, were buried from a place at the peace table. The peace terms were to be hammered out by 32 nations, large and small, that had either been at war with or had served relations with Germany. From the start, it was clear that the conference was too big for Wilson's dream of open convenance openly arrived at. Soon such prickly problems as territorial boundaries were passed to special commissions. A council of 10 with 2 members from each principal Allied power, Britain, France, the United States, Italy, and Japan, was set up as the ruling body, but the crucial decisions fell to the so-called Big Four Clumsia, Lloyd George Wilson and Premier Vittorio Orlando of Italy. The Big Four could not have been more unlike in background temperament and their views on what the peace should mean to their own countries. Clemenceau, fondly called the Tiger by his countrymen, was chairman of the conference and a formidable figure across any table. He habitually wore a skull cap, gloves to hide the emphysema on his hands, and a sardonic air, a radical in his youth, long since grown cynical. He remarked when he first heard of Wilson's 14 points: God gave us the 10 Commandments, and we broke them. Wilson gave us his 14 points, and we shall see. He was willing to indulge Wilson's lofty generalities as long as he got what he wanted: a Germany that would never again be in a position to invade France as it had twice in the past 50 years. The Tigers wanted France tricolor planted on the Rhine, or failing that, a separate Rhineland as a buffer state. Lloyd George, at age 56, was a Welshman with a shock of white hair, a quick tongue, and a cheerful mien that masked a flair for adroit political maneuvering. He had battled his way to the top by denouncing the aristocratic establishment and fighting for such radical social reforms as old age pensions. He was now a true pragmatist. He and his Liberal Party had just won a new vote of confidence in a post-armistice election based on a pugnacious campaign pledged to squeeze the German orange until the pips squeak. In Paris, he intended to preserve Britain's supremacy of the seas and to restore its pre-war trading advantages. Orlando, a Gentile and learned man, was there to see that Italy received the territories it had been secretly promised in 1915 and by Britain and France as a reward for joining the war on the Allied side. At Wilson's insistence, the conference dealt first with the Covenant, the Constitution of the League of Nations. The word covenant was Wilson's choice, an echo of his predestined boyhood. He devoutly believed the League would be the instrument by which future wars would be prevented, but the specific posed complications. To placate critics back home who were fearful of yielding up United States sovereignty, Wilson had to insist that the covenant include a phrase stating that the League did not supersede regional understandings like the Moore Doctrine. The Japanese raised an embarrassing point when they urged that the covenant affirm the principle of racial equality. This was traded off by an amendment requiring all decisions made at league meetings be unanimously approved, thus giving veto power to any one member. The president compromised one other issue in the hope that the league would later put things right. 2 cases arose regarding Italy and Japan.